The last thing Bonnie Tyler said, or the last thing that the people who were there would eventually quietly share, was not about the song. It was not about the charts or the tours or the 40 years of singing the same 6 minutes and 58 seconds to rooms that kept filling up long after they were supposed to stop. It was not about Jim Steinman or the surgery in 1976 or the voice the doctor said was ruined and the world decided was perfect. It was something smaller, something that sounded to the people who heard it exactly like her. That, more than anything, was the part that stayed with them. Wales in July is a specific thing, not the gray-pressed, low-sky Wales of autumn and winter that she had grown up in and carried inside her all her life. The Wales of colliery steam and chapel Sundays and a sky that felt personal in its weight. July Wales is different, greener than it has any right to be. The hills in the Neath Valley going a deep and particular shade that has no exact name in any language. The air carrying something that is neither warm nor cool but precisely itself. The kind of morning that makes a person understand, without being able to explain it, why people who leave this place keep finding reasons to come back. She was in Wales. She had always come back to Wales. The house was the house she and Robert had lived in for decades. The same walls, the same garden, the same view of the hills from the kitchen window that she had looked at on thousands of ordinary mornings, and which had never, across all of them, lost its quality of being sufficient. There is a word in Welsh, hirith, that carries the weight of longing for a home you cannot return to, a nostalgia for something irretrievably past. She had felt it, across the years, for the Wales of her childhood, the specific Wales of Skewen in the 1950s and 1960s, the colliery and the chapel and the pavement singing. But she had also always had this Wales, the present tense Wales outside this kitchen window, and that had meant that Hirith had never quite taken her completely. Robert was there. He had been there the whole time. 53 years of there, which was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary fact about Bonnie Tyler's life. The one that tended to get mentioned last in the retrospectives and deserved, in her own private accounting, to have been mentioned first. The morning of July 9, 2026 began the way most mornings in that house began. The kettle, the window, the hills, the garden had been her particular project across the years. Not in the grand, designed sense of a garden that is meant to be looked at. She had never had patience for things that existed primarily to be admired. A working garden. Vegetables along one wall, the roses she had inherited from a previous owner and kept because they had established themselves thoroughly enough that removing them would have required more effort than was reasonable. A corner she had been working on for the past few springs that was beginning, finally, to do what she had intended it to do with the light at certain times of day. She gardened the way she had always approached most things, with practical attention rather than sentiment, with the specific satisfaction of a person who wants to see what will happen if they try a thing and is willing to put in the time to find out. Robert had learned over the decades to let her garden without commentary. Early in the marriage he had occasionally made suggestions, which had been received with the kind of courteous attention that precedes their being ignored, and eventually he had understood that the garden was hers in a way that required no input, and that the best thing he could offer was to keep clear of the rows and occasionally bring out a cup of tea. She came in from the garden that morning at around 9. Her hand still had the particular darkness of garden soil in the creases of her palms, the same darkness he had thought more than once that her father's hands had carried from the colliery, the different earth of two different kinds of work. She washed them at the kitchen sink in the brisk, efficient way she washed them, and dried them on the kitchen towel, and sat at the table and picked up her tea. The hills were doing what the hills did in July. She watched them for a while without speaking, and he let her, because he had learned the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that was doing something. And this was the second kind. She said, eventually, that it was a good morning. He agreed that it was. She had turned 75 in June. The birthday had been quiet. Her preference always for the significant ones as much as for the unremarkable ones. A dinner, a small number of people. The kind of evening that ends at a reasonable hour because everyone present is old enough to understand that the pleasure of a thing is not improved by extending it past the point where it is still a pleasure. She had looked well, those who saw her said afterward, which was both true and the thing people say when they are looking for the right words and have not quite found them. She had been singing as recently as the spring. Not a major tour. Nothing with the trucks and the road crew and the arena infrastructure of her peak years. Something smaller and more deliberate. The kind of dates that a 75-year-old voice could sustain and that a 75-year-old woman could choose on her own terms, in venues where she could see the faces in the front row without squinting. She had always preferred to see the faces. She had said, in one of her last interviews, that the face of someone in a front row who is genuinely present, not recording it, not performing their own enjoyment, but actually there, was the thing she had spent 50 years looking for, and that she still found it every time, and that it never got less remarkable. The tour had finished in April. She had come home to Wales in the way she always came home to Wales, quietly, without announcement, by the specific relief of returning to the only place in the world that asked nothing of her except to be herself. She had been home for 3 months when July came. Robert had made the tea that morning. This was not unusual. It had been his tea more mornings than not. Across the decades, the particular domestic division of labor that establishes itself in long marriages not through negotiation but through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of days in which one person happens to be nearest the kettle and the arrangement simply continues. He made the tea. She took the first cup to the kitchen table and looked at the hills. And the morning proceeded in the way that mornings in that house had always proceeded. They talked. This was also not unusual. They had always talked, which sounds obvious but isn't, because there are long marriages in which conversation has calcified into routine and the words exchanged across a kitchen table are no longer communication so much as a kind of shared background noise, comfortable and essentially silent. Theirs had not become that. Across 53 years they had kept talking in the way that people talk when they are still, after all of it, genuinely curious about what the other person thinks. She talked about the garden. Something about a particular corner of it that had been doing something unexpected with the light in the early morning, a quality she had noticed for several days and kept meaning to mention. She talked about a letter she wanted to write to someone she had been thinking about. She asked Robert whether he had heard a particular piece of music on the radio the previous evening, and he said he had, and they discussed it briefly, with the mild disagreement that had characterized their discussions of music for 5 decades, and that had always ended the same way, which was with both of them being right about different things. It was an ordinary morning. She had always loved ordinary mornings. She had spent too many of them away from home, in hotel rooms in cities she couldn't always remember the names of, to have ever stopped being grateful for the ones that were simply this. Tea, the hills, Robert. Sometime in the middle of the morning, she said she was tired. Not in a way that alarmed him. She said it in the matter-of-fact way she said most things, without drama or implication, as a statement of fact rather than a complaint. She had been tired before. She had sung 50 years of concerts and carried a voice that worked harder than most people understood, and tiredness was an old companion she had long since made peace with. She went to rest. Robert sat in the kitchen with the newspaper and the last of the tea. The morning continued outside the window in the way that Welsh July mornings continue, the light moving across the hills with the particular slowness of long summer days, the garden going from the deep, cool green of early morning to the brighter, flatter green of midday. The birds in the garden, which she had always fed and which she had named with the specific, unsentimental practicality of someone who notices creatures without sentimentalizing them. The kettle, cooling on the hob. At some point he went to check on her. She was awake, or had been. She was in that particular state of half-sleep that belongs to a summer rest in a quiet room, neither quite here nor quite elsewhere, the eyes slightly open and the breathing slow. He sat beside her. He had been sitting beside her, in one form or another, for 53 years, and he was good at it, at the specific discipline of being present for someone without requiring anything of the moment, which is a rarer quality than it is usually given credit for. She opened her eyes fully and looked at him. What came next was the thing that the people who eventually heard it would carry for the rest of their lives. Not because it was grand, because it was true. She looked at Robert Sullivan, the man she had married in 1973, before she was famous, before the surgery, before the name Bonnie Tyler had meant anything to anyone beyond a small circuit of South Wales venues and the people who loved her in Skewen. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, directly, with the unsentimental clarity of someone who had never needed to perform anything for this particular person, because this particular person had known who she was long before performing had become a requirement of her days. She said, "I had a good run, didn't I?" Not a question, quite. Not a declaration exactly. Something between the two. The kind of sentence that arrives in the voice of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally found the right words for it. Simple words. 4 of them, and then one. "I had a good run, didn't I?" Robert looked at her. He was not a man who reached quickly for sentiment, which was one of the reasons she had married him. He thought about it for a moment, the way he had always thought about things she said genuinely, as though every sentence she produced was worth the effort of considering properly. Then he said, "The best I've ever seen." She smiled. Not the stage smile. Not the one that could fill an arena and reach the back row and had been doing so for 50 years. The other one. The one that belonged only to the kitchen and the garden and the hills and the man sitting beside her who had been making her tea for 53 years and had never once made it wrong. She closed her eyes again. The news reached the world later that day. It moved, as significant news moves now, faster than any previous generation's version of fast, across platforms and through networks and into the pockets of people who had not been expecting it, arriving without ceremony into the middle of ordinary days and asking those ordinary days to pause and accommodate something larger than they had been designed to hold. Within hours, Total Eclipse of the Heart was the most streamed song on every platform in every country where streaming data could be measured. This was not surprising, because it had been the most streamed song under these conditions before, every time the world had needed to reach for the specific quality of that voice and find it waiting. What was different about this time was that the song would not relinquish the top position in the days that followed. It stayed there, not because of an eclipse or an anniversary or a film or a meme, but because people kept pressing play individually and in private, in the way you press play on something that has been yours for a long time and that you are not yet ready to let go of. Radio stations around the world played it without announcement, without introduction, simply played it, because the song was its own introduction and always had been. Concert halls in cities that had hosted her over the decades left their marquee lights on. In the United States, where the song had debuted at #1 in 1983 and where it had returned to the top of the charts with every significant eclipse since, it arrived again. Not because of any celestial event, but because the specific darkness it described had returned in a different form, and the world knew, in the wordless way that music communicates these things, that this was the correct response. In New York, someone left a single flower at the entrance to the building that had once housed the power station, where the song had been recorded in the winter of 1982. The building had changed. It was something else now, had been something else for years, but the address remained the same, and the flower remained there for 3 days before anyone moved it. Jim Steinman had died in April 2021. The song had outlasted its composer and its singer both. It would outlast a great many more things before it was done, which was perhaps the most accurate possible description of what it was. In Skewen, in the Neath Valley, someone placed flowers at the gate of the community center where a teenage girl had once lost a talent contest to a man with an accordion, got up the next morning and walked back in to ask for a spot on the Friday nights. The flowers were from no one specific. They had been left, and more followed, and by the evening there were enough to require someone to decide what to do with them. The chapel on the corner, the one with the lopsided gate that she had never pushed straight, all the years she had walked past it, had its door open. It had been a long time since a Sunday morning had filled it the way Sunday mornings used to fill it. But that evening, it filled. There is a particular quality to the legacies of people who were always, underneath everything, exactly who they appeared to be. No revision is required when they are gone, no reassessment, no excavation of a hidden self that the public version was concealing. What you saw was what was there, and what was there was what you heard in the voice, that ravaged, impossible, surviving voice that the doctors had said was finished and the world had said was perfect, and that had turned out, across 50 years of evidence, to be simply true. She had grown up in a mining village in Wales, and she had sung in pubs before she was legally allowed to be there, and she had defied a surgeon's orders and accidentally invented the most distinctive instrument in the pop music of her generation, and she had pushed until Jim Steinman said yes, and she had married Robert Sullivan in 1973, and she had stayed married to him through all of it, every last decade of it, and she had sung the same song 10,000 times and meant it each time, and finished 19th at Eurovision at the age of 61, and called a stranger on the telephone during a pandemic to say thank you for a letter, and stood in actual darkness on the deck of a ship in the Atlantic and kept singing after the light came back. She had had a good run, the best anyone had seen. Robert Sullivan did not speak to the press. He had not spoken to the press in 53 years of marriage, and he saw no reason to begin now. He stayed in the house in Wales, in the kitchen with the view of the hills, and he made his tea in the mornings and let the world say what it was going to say, which was a great deal and which he did not read. But on the third day he went into the garden she had always tended and always returned to and always talked about with the specific, practical affection of someone who trusted growing things. He stood in the corner she had mentioned that last morning, the one with the unexpected quality of light in early morning, and he looked at it for a while. He did not say anything. There was nobody there to say anything to, and he had never been a man who needed an audience for his private moments, which was another reason she had married him. He simply looked at the corner of the garden and the light and the hills beyond the wall, and the specific Welsh sky doing what the Welsh sky does in July, which is to be itself, unhurried and particular and not quite like any other sky anywhere else in the world. He had told her it was the best he'd ever seen. He had meant it absolutely. He had been telling her the truth in one form or another for 53 years, and he was not going to stop now just because she was no longer in the kitchen to hear it. The letters arrived the following week, not dozens, thousands, from countries she had toured and countries she had never visited, from people who had been at the concerts in 1983 and people who had heard the song for the first time on the morning of July 10 when the algorithm delivered it to a phone in a room somewhere and something in the first 4 bars had stopped them from scrolling, from people who had been married to the song quite literally, who had walked down aisles with it and danced their first dances to it and said goodbye to people they loved with it playing in rooms that smelled of flowers and grief, from people in languages she would not have been able to read, which did not make them any less clear in their intention. Many of them addressed her directly, in the present tense, as though the difference between writing to someone and writing about someone was a distinction that the feeling was not observing. Some addressed Robert carefully, with the particular consideration of strangers who wanted to say something to a real person rather than to a public figure, and were aware of the difference. Robert did not read most of them, but he read some. He read the ones that mentioned mornings, particularly, the ones that described putting the kettle on and the song coming on the radio and the specific, unrepeatable quality of an ordinary morning that has become, without warning, the last ordinary morning of something. He understood those letters in the way that he understood most things, quietly and completely, and without needing to say so to anyone. The house in Wales remained the house in Wales. The garden continued to do what she had asked it to do with the light in the corner, which she had not lived to see fully resolved but which was resolving itself nonetheless, because growing things do not wait for permission and do not pause for grief, which was perhaps something she would have found characteristic and correct. The hills were the hills. The sky was the sky. The kettle was where it had always been. Some things, it turns out, continue, not in spite of loss but through it, carrying the weight of what has happened in their ordinary, unremarkable persistence, which is its own form of tribute and its own kind of staying.